the Harris Football Podcast with your host, Christopher Harris.
Welcome. Welcome in. Hey, I am Chris Harris. This is the Harris Football Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I know what it's like, despite your best research, your best roster moves. It's just not happening. Your fantasy team isn't responding. You're falling out of the race. And I'm sorry. I know every call I make fantasy-wise isn't the right one. Every call life-wise I make isn't the right one. But sometimes fantasy-wise I do lead you down the wrong path. The reason I bring this up is not for self-flagellation. It's not to rub salt in your wounds. It's to mention that this is something I'm totally aware of. And this is the first football season where I've had a platform to talk to you every weekday. And my promise is that even if you're depressed by your fantasy team and you feel like the season is a lost cause, I hope you're still going to find something in every episode of the little podcast that'll be fun for you, or, make you think, or make you wonder about next season. In other words, I'm not going to keep doing exactly the same show as the season progresses. There'll be little hints and tricks for DFS sprinkled here and there, some dynasty talk about future players, definitely something to make you laugh, hopefully, a little bit of draft theory for next year, and definitely as the season gets late, we'll spend time thinking about 2016 rookies and other stuff for next year. This is just my way of saying, if you've been entertained by the show, but feel like you're losing interest a little bit in 2015, hang in there. I think you'll stay entertained, and I feel your pain.
Today's kickoff.
It's our Week 7 Ranks-a-Palooza. I got a couple hundred responses to, your Week 7 ranks inquiries. I sifted through them. I'll talk about the players we had the most questions about. Hey, it's a tough week with some really good offenses on bye. Packers, Bengals, Bears, Broncos. A lot of stars that we were counting on, right? And they're all off this week. So the ranks were tough to do, and they have some weirdness in them for sure. We'll have a listener song, a little cultural jabber, and then Loza of Yahoo Fantasy will come aboard, and we'll touch on some more of the players who have a little tinge of controversy about them as far as Week 7 ranks go. Hey, have I mentioned how much I like the SeatGeek app? I was a SeatGeek user before this podcast was even a twinkle in my eye. I tried other sports ticket apps, but SeatGeek was the best. I felt like when I used SeatGeek, I got more options. You see tickets from hundreds of sellers. Most important for me was that deal score feature they have. I am not an expert when it comes to buying sports tickets, and SeatGeek has an algorithm that gives you a deal score for every seat that you see. So let's say this week I want to buy 2 tickets for Jets-Patriots or one of the Baseball League Championship Series. I can look at the entire building, see virtually every ticket available, and the SeatGeek app rates how good a deal the ticket is. It's excellent, it's free to install, and every ticket you buy is backed by a 100% guarantee. So do it. Install the free SeatGeek app, and once you do, enter my promo code Harris, and that way you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Go get SeatGeek, install it, and enter promo code Harris. All right. So I want to start. Here's a question for you, and I don't mean this rhetorically, because I don't necessarily think there's a perfect answer. What is the best predictor of future performance in the NFL? Go ahead. Say your answer out loud. I'll wait. Is it last week's result? Many of you tweeters seem to think so, and many fantasy football rankers seem to think so too. What I'm asking is, when anyone sits down to produce weekly ranks, what should the most important factor be? Should it be stats from last week? Should it be stats from the last 3 weeks or however many weeks? I say for sure that factors in, but for the way I look at the NFL, it's not the most important factor. For me, I think you know this. Talent is king. Talent that's been proven to me on game film. And the longer a player has shown me that talent, the more I'm apt to believe in it. The more I'm apt to believe, for instance, that a struggling player will eventually bounce back if I know what talent he owns. Of course, recency isn't completely meaningless, but what I'm not going to do is invent a narrative for why a formerly good player is struggling. So let's start your Q&A today with a representative question from AG on Twitter, at Harris Football. Chris, please explain why Lacy is in your top 20 rest of the season. So, I was on Sigmund Bloom's podcast on Tuesday, which was great. It was a sprawling conversation, a full hour about the state of a lot of players. Really recommend you looking up Sigmund Bloom's Twitter account, at Sigmund Bloom, and you'll find a link. And I've retweeted a couple times too. Really recommend you listen to Sig's podcast. And we talked, among other things, about how to value Lacy. So, here's a player who's been butt, right, for 2 weeks in a row, and who looked like he was benched. Maybe not benched, but at least second string to James Starks in what was supposed to be the matchup that was going to turn him around against the Chargers. Doesn't help. He hasn't found the end zone since week 1. But we should acknowledge that he was at least okay for 3 of his first 4 games. But he is ticking fantasy owners off. I'm not going to give a player like Lacy, who has 11 and 13 touchdowns in his first 2 NFL seasons, and whose skill set, he's got really good feet for his size. He's got good receiving hands. I'm going to give him a lot of rope. Did I lower him in my rest of the season ranks this week? I did. But, as AG notes, and as many of you noted, I didn't take him out of the top 10. I think it's a buy low opportunity on Lacy. But obviously, you want to buy pretty darn low. There's absolutely a risk that Starks could be a big factor coming out of the Green Bay bye. There's absolutely a risk he could be a factor all year. But it's a long season. I think stuff like this tends to come out in the wash, and talent rises to the top in good situations if that talent isn't injured. So my approach is going to be to trust the guys I know are good. Now, I know a bunch of folks look at the rest of the season ranks like a trade chart. That's not exactly how it should be used. I think it can be useful in that regard. But for example, with Lacy, I have him 19th overall right now. I have Brandon Marshall 20th overall right now. If I have Marshall, would I trade him for Lacy right now? I would not. Marshall's red hot. Lacy is not. I would want to give a lot less for Lacy, even if it's a buy low, right? Because his perceived value is much lower. If I had a trade value chart on harrisfootball.com, which was based on current perceived value, which actually is a good idea, except, I barely sleep as it is. Lacy would of course be significantly lower because his perceived value is much lower. If I'm trading for Lacy, I want to trade Eric Decker and Chris Johnson for Lacy, not Brandon Marshall. And that's me. That's how I look at veterans who've proven their talent on film. I tend to assume that the worm will turn, and I feel like more often than not it does. Not always, I admit, and maybe that earns me a reputation for being stubborn and not jumping all over the hot new thing to a significant enough degree to suit you. But patience and avoiding dumb explanations like, Eddie Lacy's fat now, right? Don't do it, right? I think patience and avoiding those explanations tends to work out. And you're going to notice this is going to be a theme as I answer your questions today. You know how I mentioned off the top that the little podcast that could will stay dedicated to helping you enjoy the rest of the NFL season, even if your fantasy team has hit the skids? One way to keep the fun going is DraftKings. If you're bummed about your commissioner-style team at this very moment, I'm talking to you. Here's my advice. Get your league mates together in a private group on DraftKings. All you have to do is submit their emails to invite them to your group and have a weekly tournament. I do this. It's really fun. Just me and, 11 of my friends, and we all build a new team every week on DraftKings. Some bragging rights, a little cash, all the stuff maybe your commissioner-style fantasy team isn't going to get you this year. You know what it's like? It's like getting your buddies together to play a poker tournament, except instead of cards, this is fantasy football. If it sounds interesting but you haven't tried DraftKings, now's your chance. Play this weekend on me. Go to DraftKings.com, enter promo code Harris, and they'll give you a free contest to try it out. That's DraftKings.com, promo code Harris. So the most asked about player in my Week 7 ranks, which you can see at harrisfootball.com, was Steve Smith. And many of you don't like that I have Smith so high. Harry Brenner, Steve Smith at 5 against a good pass defense. Brandon Coates, Steve Smith is pretty high, no. Jonathan, Steve Smith in the top 5 against a top 10 Arizona pass defense seems high ahead of Larry Fitzgerald against a porous Ravens pass defense. Really funny. I mean, I think these are good questions. I can never predict where the listeners' pressure points are going to be. I never would have expected it would be Smith this week, even against the Cardinals. You know, I can't say that he won't wear down the way he did toward the end of last year, but until I see signs that he can't get open, man, I think I want to use him, regardless of matchup. Yeah, we saw him faceplant against the Broncos in Week 1, so he's not perfect. And, of course, he got hurt against the Steelers. But in those other 3 games, 16, 17, and 10 targets, at least 137 receiving yards. And on tape, so tough to cover, especially when you zone him up. You know, he's going to see some zone in any game he plays, and he's a zone killer. You know, I'm not sure if Jonathan, the tweeter, is asking about Fitzgerald versus Smith for theoretical reasons because he's offended, or if this is an actual decision he has to make. But I did. I ranked Smith ahead of Fitz because John Brown was awesome last week, and Michael Floyd could easily have had 3 touchdowns. And as much as I like how Fitzgerald's playing and being used, and he's number 7 on my list, so yeah, I mean, you're starting him too. There is a little tiny risk, right, that he takes a week off with other good weapons in Arizona, even in a good matchup, whereas Smith is, again, pretty close to the only game in town. Hard to imagine he doesn't get you double-digit targets. I will grant you, Patrick Peterson has been following top receivers all over the formation this year, and that's somewhat of a concern. But, you know, maybe less so out of the slot. Against Calvin Johnson, you know, I saw it occasionally out of the slot, but it was one way they got Megatron free from Peterson. And, you know, Smitty does line up there. He had 51 of his routes have been run from the slot so far this year. You know, to be determined, but, you know, I'm a believer. A whole lot of Steeler passing game questions. Some representative tweets. Cesar A. says, Martavis Bryant at 15 with Jones at quarterback. Is the minimal targets a concern? Chris Lozy says, hey Harris, should I worry about Martavis's production dipping when Big Ben returns? Looks like the real deal, but Antonio Brown exists. And Kyle Critchfield says, the Antonio Brown rank, does that assume that Big Ben is playing? Otherwise seems way too high considering how bad he's been the last 3 weeks. So it's interesting because there were several other Steeler passing game questions. These 3 fine gentlemen have sort of different stories to tell for what will happen. You know, Bryant will be hurt by Big Ben's return, or Brown has been bad enough that he maybe should be benched, or there aren't enough targets for Bryant to be useful. And really, any of these things could be right. They're not unrealistic scenarios. It's like nobody's saying no Steeler receiver will be any good all year, even with Roethlisberger in there. Like, everybody's saying something that could be right, but we can't know usage. We shouldn't listen to players or coaches. We should go by what we see. And of course, you know, Brown hasn't given you much since the Big Ben injury, and we don't really know if Landry Jones is any good. I think he's better than Mike Vick, but we don't really know. And we don't know if Landry Jones can go on the road and win in the NFL, which is not an easy thing to do. But I'm playing great players most times. I'm pot committed to talent. If Antonio Brown wants to go ahead and have a season where he, you know, scores 5 touchdowns, I guess I lose. But, you know, even with his quarterback problems, he's on pace for 100-plus catches and 1,500 yards. I'd say just use him. As for Martavis Bryant, I'm with Steeler fan Sig Bloom of footballguys.com here. You watch Martavis Bryant with the ball in his hands, and you see Josh Gordon. He is a scary man. I think Pittsburgh's offense is going to be the best in the NFL when Big Ben is back. Talent is what I see. No, I didn't rank as though Big Ben would be back this week. This is what I feel about the Steelers' talent. Max VDB asks, why so high on LaShawn McCoy rest of the season ahead of Devontae Freeman? Even Carlos Hyde and Doug Martin have looked just as good in a few of their games. All right, so I probably shouldn't devote too much more time to a Devontae Freeman conversation. I think you're all getting sick of that. I don't rank off of the past box scores very much. Obviously, Freeman's been amazing to this point, but rest of season ranks, you don't get credit for past touchdowns. Oh boy. Here I go again, Freeman. I don't hate Freeman at all. As far as I'm concerned, when we're looking at Devontae Freeman, we have two choices when we're analyzing him. Either he's a generational talent like a Maurice Jones-Drew who can succeed despite his size over a long period of time, or he's been a little bit of a fluke who's still valuable and still has a role, but who's probably heading for some kind of gentle market correction. On tape, I don't see MJD. I don't see, the varied, powerful, that goal line doesn't matter, like I'm getting in, the pocket Hercules thing, right? So I tend toward the gentle market correction, which I know in some folks' minds will translate as he hates Devontae.
He hates these cans!
But anyway, yeah, Hyde and Martin versus McCoy. The thing is, when I think about Shady, I'm not just thinking about his couple good games this year or this past week, the good game. I know what Shady is. He's earned it with talent over multiple seasons. I really like Hyde, but I won't do this to Cousin Josh, but to all of you, I acknowledge he's on a stinky team and game flow can certainly get the better of him, and Doug Martin can't go much higher for me because how can you trust the health? And again, his situation can be a little precarious week to week as Charles Sims really does play a lot. Tampa isn't that good. Anyway, I like LaShawn McCoy more. Some Phillip Rivers questions, especially as it relates to Cam Newton. That was a theme in 4 separate tweets. I'll give you 2 of them. Voltaire says, your love of Cam Newton is well documented, but putting him ahead of Rivers versus that awful Oakland secondary is puzzling. And Steve Lynch says, Rivers' schedule looks good, so I traded for him, but I also have Cam. Cam is 52 in your rest of the season ranks, and no Rivers. Why Cam the rest of the way? So I do think it's fair to think of these two quarterbacks in the same breath. In terms of NFL quarterbacking, actually, you'd have to give Rivers the advantage. He's done it over a longer period of time, and he has constructed an above-average passing offense in San Diego, which is something that Cam really hasn't done. Like I sometimes say, though, running quarterbacks. They're basically the one major place where fantasy just diverges from real-life NFL evaluation. Newton just wrecks everything with his legs. I just find the baseline a little bit safer. And with Rivers, I ranked him fine this week. He's just a little below Newton. Beware of recency bias. He was wonderful statistically this past week. He's got 20-plus fantasy points in 3 straight games. However, my experience with Rivers tells me there's always a storm brewing with this guy. Take a look at his game log from Week 9 forward last year, and remember all the sub-200-yard passing days and the think pieces about what's wrong with Phil Rivers. He just showed you his highs are high, but if I'm comparing him to the non-running quarterbacks, the non-throw-first guys who are more consistent, I think he loses in that comparison. Ryan Malady says, Tyrod Taylor so high, even after an MCL sprain and no Percy Harvins and probably no Sammy Watkins? That's a good question, Ryan. Definitely gives me pause. How much will Taylor be able to run if his knee isn't any good? I'll pay attention to what the on-the-ground reporters in London are saying about the way Taylor's moving around, and I definitely will be open to dropping him if he is going to play but winds up looking like he can't run. For sure, you're right. Ryan is right. The weaponry isn't there. And anyway, a bet on Taylor is more a bet on the safety and upside of some rushing, so we'll check back on that one. Dirty Lou says, pretty high on Theo Riddick, and I agree with others. Charles Sims seems low. And that was a fairly representative tweet about several folks sent about Charles Sims. I mentioned Sims earlier. Let's start with the Lions. I saw folks like Matt Strikes on Twitter who said Joique Bell should be higher if he plays, which, maybe. With so many moving parts in that Lions backfield, Abdullah fumbling, Zenner out for the year, Bell maybe finally coming back, my approach this week was, you know what, even in the standard league, I'll rank Riddick highest because he leads all NFL running backs in catches, and it feels like he probably can't be victimized by game flow as much, and hey, if they give him standard carries, so much the better. They did last week. That was my logic to try and take something as opposed to guessing about the other guys. But I don't think guessing is wrong, and I do agree that Riddick probably doesn't have the upside of whoever winds up asserting himself as the feature back. As for Charles Sims, very surprised how many folks are into him. I think it's kind of smart thinking, really. He does play a lot of snaps in Tampa, between 23 and 36 snaps every game this year. I like the way you guys and gals think. Now, we have to be honest that to this point, Sims has really only made fantasy respectability because of basically 2 long receptions, and, the tackling on one of those against the Texans, I particularly remember, was a total joke. Hard to promise that the long plays recur, but I also think that he's at a level where he's pretty interchangeable with a lot of guys ranked near him, and if you have a feeling that some of that usage is going to translate to more consistent stats and, sort of play-to-play consistency, pretty good talent and some opportunity, I think I can buy that. Austin Williams says, if Lamar Miller has another big week, will he see a significant rise in your rest of the season ranks? So let's see. Right now, Miller's 44th in my standard league ranks for the rest of the season, and that's already a very big hike compared to last week. My answer is probably going to be no. Could he join the Hyde, Yeldon, Doug Martin group and maybe go 10 spots higher? Yeah. But I think much higher than that, I'm probably going to resist. I'm not sure. I've said this many times. Lamar Miller, I'm not sure he's a great player. The usage was great last week. I hope that continues. Finally got to see him show some speed, some better blocking. I've never been convinced that Miller's a complete back. Feel like he needed a bunch of short scores to wow us last year. Not convinced that the Dolphins are ready to give him 20 touches a game. I think he can be an above-average NFL runner, not a great one. Matthew Shipper says, why are you lower on Laxatives Murray this week compared to most rankers? And I can't speak to most rankers. But I can talk about Murray. It's funny, given how much Eddie Lacy concern is out there. I would think there would be big-time Latavius Murray concern as well. The last 2 games we saw Laxatives, he was getting benched in the second half. So my hope is he comes out and takes that workload away from Roy Halou and Marcel Reese and whoever else and takes advantage of a good matchup against the Chargers because, I definitely buy into the raw talent, and I own him in so many leagues. But I admit, we haven't really seen him apply that raw talent enough consistently. I think the Raiders see that too, hence the reason probably why they benched him. I have Latavius at 14 among running backs, so, I wouldn't have thought I was down on him at that number. I do think that's a realistic number for a dude who has something to prove. Very quickly, just a few more that were multiple asks. David Voth, if Big Ben plays, how high would you rank him? Number 3 maybe? He's an every week starter. Have I mentioned I'm excited for the Steelers to get healthy? Josh Hahn says, where would Deshaun Jackson be ranked in PPR if he plays? So right now I have Pierre Garçon 22 in a PPR. That would probably have to come down. But Djax is awfully boom and bust, and he's not really a great PPR player because the volume doesn't tend to be there. So maybe mid-30s among wide receivers in the first week back so he can prove that his hamstring isn't going to go pop. And Jay has a question kind of just in general. Can you explain a little on the podcast how you develop rest of the season ranks? Well, it is a long and annoyingly excruciating and detailed process every week. It's a spreadsheet. I start with last week's spreadsheet as a template, and I literally move players to one side or the other. These guys have to go up. These guys have to go down. And I think, okay, I'm drafting a team for the rest of the year. Who's next? Obviously, I have to keep the universe of players I didn't have ranked last week close at hand, too. For those late risers, Gary Barnidge made the top 100 this week. Because, hey, don't go crazy, but red zone looks are nice. We like those. Anyway, that's how I do it. the value I think they have for the rest of the year.
Harris's music digression.
I'm the deal, I'm the man, like a flash in the pan, and you can't stop me scoring. You're so meek with my butt cheek, that's 6 more for me. The touchdown rain keeps pouring. Here comes the first down, even if it's thrown by Josh McCown. But something's blocking my way. Please don't stop my gravy train. Oh no, it's a mashed potato mountain. Oh no, it's a mashed potato mountain.
That is awesome. Do you know your classic rock? I think that's based on Rainbow, Man on the Silver Mountain. That's our buddy Steve Barry. We have other songs too. That's Steve's second one this week, but it seemed appropriate considering my metaphor about the gravy train hitting Mashed Potato Mountain. I believe on Monday I somehow said that. That came out of my mouth. And hence we have another entry into the mixtapes. It's actually longer than what I just played you, so go to harrisfootball.com/mixtapes and you can hear the full rendition of Steve Barry's latest masterwork. Thank you very much, Steve. Classic rock. Steve joked in his emails, eventually I will do a song that is not 40 years old.
It's time for Pointless Cultural Jabber.
I promised several folks on Twitter that I would find time for a book recommendation. If you don't want to hear it, fast forward a couple minutes. I apologize. I may have mentioned I was in Austin this past winter. I didn't have my books with me. I'm not really a Kindle guy. I did reread a bunch of my favorites online, and one of them is The Good Soldier by Ford Maddox Ford. I'd forgotten how much I love it. I just reread it again these past couple of weeks. Now, realize I'm a literary snoot. I'm not going to give you a super easy, light, fluffy beach read at any point, and I'm sorry about that. But it's who I am. It's what my tastes are. So The Good Soldier, written in 1915, one of the earliest, one of the best impressionist novels. It's funny. It's scathing and complicated. Got one of the most memorable, unreliable narrators I can think of. It's one of the great novels of the last century. Pretty short, deceptively simple seeming, but, gradually, as the narrator keeps spooling around, kind of going around and around over the same episodes, the truth starts to come out. He starts to seem a little bit like a sociopath. I really love it. It's kind of like a Victorian drama of manners book that gets turned on its ear. It's a little grisly at times. Anyway, I'm not going to say it's in my overall top 10, but, top 50, definitely. And I just reread it. And the first line is, "This is the saddest story I've ever heard." And what a great first line. And it kind of is, but it really kind of isn't. Great, great book.
Today's guest.
And today's guest, it's Liz Loza from Yahoo Fantasy, and I think you know her from lots of other jobs too, but now she's been co-opted by the man, and she is part of the problem, not part of the solution, I believe we would say, Liz. Would that be right?
Oh, I've never been happier to be co-opted in my life, except for maybe that one time, like in my sophomore year of high school by the football player. But,
Nice. Well, no, it's great. You're doing a really great job at Yahoo. Please follow Liz on Twitter at LizLoza_FF. And I've spent a good part of the show talking about some ranks questions from listeners, and it's fun on Wednesdays to have an expert on and look at each other's ranks and kind of find some interesting points of comparison. Not so much to say someone's right or someone's wrong, but more to talk about, this is interesting, like help the listeners, go about making their decisions. Are you game for a little of that?
Hit me up, Chris. Let's do it.
Okay, so we're going to start at quarterback and start at Blake Bortles. So in our ranks, at least, I should emphasize, these are obviously always preliminary ranks. We have to do them on Tuesday before anybody practices or anything else, and so it is fair to say they could change. But as of our initial ranks, you had him 8th, and I have him 13th. Not a huge difference. So this is more a philosophical question. I think on the one hand, everybody knows that Blake Bortles has had some good numbers. I think on the other hand, everybody knows Blake Bortles, maybe not that great a quarterback. So when do you decide not to bet into a winning streak? It feels like for you this week, you don't want to bet into the Blake Bortles winning streak.
Well, I just don't. I'm not particularly frightened by Buffalo's defense, despite their reputation. I mean, and maybe Mario Williams calling out the team will motivate them in London. By the way, watch With the World live on Yahoo.
There you go.
The game is live streamed.
So appropriate. I've had Andy on. Andy Barnes was on too this week, so I am talk about being co-opted by the man. I am like promoting the heck out of this thing.
Supporting the Yahoo, I love it. So I do feel like the emergence of Julius Thomas. Even if Julius Thomas, people can say what they want about his talent and his ankles, for that matter. But I think a target that big, I predicted a touchdown for him in week 6 because I think a target that big is just going to help further open things up for Bortles and be a nice check down option. And I also, I know his numbers were not good last week, but I am in the shoelace supporting committee. And so I also feel like the addition of Denard Robinson in that backfield can help things. I do think he's explosive. I think I was surprised that Toby Gerhart out-touched him in week 6. I think that has more to do with him easing back in after the knee sprain than anything else. And so I just was so impressed with the way he performed behind that abhorred line last year. In fact, I think he averaged 4.3 yards per carry overall behind that offensive line. And so I think that he's just another piece for Bortles to work with. And he's, again, like he's a decent passing downs back. Like he can be used in the passing game, I think, in a way that maybe Yeldon can't quite yet. Even though Yeldon, I believe his only touchdown this season has been via the air. I think that's right.
That is right.
So I think that they're building pieces around him. Like, listen, the Jags are a team in their infancy. And so there is going to be the point, I just don't think it's quite week 7, that we say, okay, Blake, like we've been hanging on to your potential for the better part of 2 seasons now. When is the engine going to turn over? For me, it's not going to be this week. I'm not entirely shaking in my boots at the thought of the Bills' defense. Their secondary does take away teams' top receivers, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later. But otherwise, I think that this could be... Buffalo doesn't throw the ball a ton, but I'd like to see Bortles come out swinging. And, and part of it, too, I haven't pulled up your rankings yet, but in comparison, the guys that would come after him, sometimes that's part of ranking, right? Like, well, I don't love this guy, but I really don't like these guys.
Well, you have ahead of Russell Wilson and Eli Manning, and to me, that's a statement.
I do, because I don't think Russell Wilson against San Francisco, even though the 49ers are much better at home, I don't think they're going to pass a lot. I'm not buying into the Jimmy Graham is seeing, 12 targets a game all the time now, or even that he's catching 10 of the 12 all the time. Mm-hmm. And so I think that most of Wilson's value is going to come from the ground, and I am very afraid of Dallas's defense with Randy Gregory coming back and Greg Hardy, the one and only Mr. Universe.
Yeah.
He did get, I believe, 2 sacks.
Oh, he was good. He was very good against the Patriots. So the bottom line comes down to I am going to say I'm worried about Bortles because I don't think he's good.
Sure.
And you're going to say you're not sure he's good, but you're willing to believe the numbers because they've been there for a few weeks and because it's you can see a lot of good weapons there. That's fair. That's 2 different ways of looking at it. It's thoroughly fair. I'll bet you a Tootsie Roll Russell Wilson versus Blake Bortles for this week.
I think that's probably right.
Right.
Sure. I will bet you the Tootsie Roll. Although if Navarro Bowman plays like he did, if he's on the upswing at home, then maybe Russell Wilson gets a little bit, a little shaken behind that line.
I just like the running. I'll take the running. All right, so we'll just finish our Jags conversation briefly. You've got Allen Robinson 23rd, and I've got him 9th, which is interesting considering you're a little bit higher on Bortles than I am. It sounds like you might be worried about the knee. And you might be worried about the Bills taking away top receiver. But let's just do a little thought experiment where, he's been limited all week. And it seems like he's going to play, and he winds up being active for the game, streaming live on Yahoo. And do you still feel like he would be outside the top 20 for you?
Well, I bought into it. I have a lot of, my friend Chris Wesseling hates this phrase, but I have a lot of shares of Allen Robinson. And I do think that I'll probably roster him, but leave him in. To me, I don't think because he's been on such a hot streak, and let's assume that the leg injury is fine and, that's just a blip. I think that when you put him in, you have to then, and this is something people don't talk about enough in fantasy, in my opinion, you need to then look at your roster and play to upside in other places. Like, you can't go for the high floor guy if you know that one of your starters is probably going to underperform. So in my estimation, then I shoot for the moon with a guy.
Isn't Robinson a moon shooter, though?
Can you say that given his consistent production, though?
I mean, he's been pretty consistent. I feel like he's been.
But I don't feel like he's a moon. So if one of your starters, I think he's been a starter. So if I think he's going to be limited, then in my flex play, I have to play somebody that I think has more higher upside.
Like, I get what you're saying. It's about it's about worrying he's limited by the leg. To some degree. He plays.
The defense. I mean, yeah. I do think that the secondary in Buffalo, I mean, they took away, who had the big game last week? It was Marvin Jones, not A.J. Green. Who had the big game against the Giants? Not Odell Beckham Jr. Gilmore got all up in that guy's head, and it was both Dwayne Harris and Ruben Randall that found the end zone. So I think that, Jarvis Landry, a different kind of player, but Jarvis Landry didn't have the game. It was Rashard Matthews who had it. And so I think that I would agree
with you, except for Stephon Gilmore's not following A.G. Green all over the field. In fact, true. Gilmore was opposite Green for a lot of the day. It was Jones was torching Gilmore for part of the day. But
point.
But we'll see. I mean, it's interesting. I'm higher on Robinson, lower on Bortles. You're higher on Bortles, lower on Robinson. It's why that's fantasy ranks make the world go round, as they say. So LeGarrette Blount.
Yeah.
I had some questions on Twitter once my ranks came out. Like, how in the world can you rank LeGarrette Blount 14th among running backs last week, which I did, and then 34th this week? Aren't you the idiot who preaches consistency and preaches, rank to talent and stuff like that? How could you have done that? I don't like LeGarrette Blount. He is a trash bag in my way of thinking, and I went against my typical not wanting to predict game flow last week, and I let myself believe that it was a LeGarrette Blount game because it was against the Colts, and that turned out to be true. You have him ranked 19th, so I don't want to paint you as a LeGarrette Blount lover either, but you're okay using him against the Jets. Give me a little sense of why.
It was probably a mistake. I mean, the more I look at it, I did my running back projections yesterday, and I only have him being projected for 61 yards and no touchdowns. So,
but then again, there's always a chance of a touchdown with Blount. I mean,
well, I think that that's the thing ultimately. Sure. And if you have already decided that you were going to rely on a piece of the Patriots backfield and eschew the whole Bill Belichick hates your fantasy squad narrative, then there is something to be said for big bruisers who fall forward over the goal line.
Absolutely.
It's not always pretty, but they do it. I do think Dion Lewis is the better play in this game, not because of game flow or any of those other things, but because I think the way to beat the Jets is, little small passes underneath, and obviously Dion Lewis can carve up defenses out of the passing game in that way, and so I think that he is the better play, certainly, but if look, Garrett Blount is, I like the Willis McGahee 3.0,
right?
In terms of vulturing, so I feel like he could do that. Yeah, and also again, I mean, this is part of it. Do I like whose chances do I see? Because at running back, right, we're hoping for the touchdown.
Sure.
That's why I tend to, if I'm going to flex somebody, outside of a PPR league, I tend to flex a running back because those are the guys who generally score touchdowns. It's a sweeping generalization, but in simplistically strategizing, I think that can hold true. And I don't know, maybe you don't agree with that, but am I gonna, put LeGarrette Blount behind? Am I gonna put TJ Yeldon ahead of LeGarrette Blount? I mean, you did. Okay.
I sure am.
So Shane Vereen, am I putting him ahead of Garrett Blount? Right.
I'm not.
So that was sort of.
I think the point stands. The point is, it's a good point because when you, especially with these four teams that happen to be on bye this week, 19 isn't really 19.
Right.
19 is 29 maybe. You'd probably have 7 or 8 guys ahead of him who would be on those two teams. So it's a fair point, and I do have a great, as a Patriots fan and as a person with eyes, I'm not a big fan of LeGarrette Blount, as is a well-known position, and he is now back to his normal level. I'm going to probably do it with Blount a couple of times this year where I think it's a Blount game and I give him a little bit of rankings love. But I think in a game like this, the Patriots don't want to sledgehammer their way against that defensive line. And, you're right. You can't predict a touchdown. And if it happens, it's going to look, starting him's going to look good.
No, I think there's going to be a lot of like Danny Amendola, and probably a frustrating amount of Danny Amendola and Julian Edelman and Deion Lewis. Like, if I were to be egotistical enough to try to get inside of Bill Belichick's head, those would be the 3 players that I would see performing the most.
And if you want to even get more, into predicting game flow and stuff like that, does Revis, decide to, do they decide to say, all right, Edelman is the key. We'll put Cromartie on Gronkowski. We'll put Revis on Edelman and let them try to beat us with their, that could be bad news for Edelman, but I don't like to do that because I don't think we often predict very well, who Revis Island will be on.
Well, and that was part of the reason I said a frustratingly large amount of Danny Amendola. Because, and that's the thing that the Patriots can do, right? Because
every week is different. That's right.
And it doesn't matter what talent is missing because Bill Belichick is able to find some guy, some Deion Lewis, some Jonas Gray, and elevate them to an elite level.
Right. So let's talk about another Patriots player. You didn't rank Brandon LaFell.
Did not.
And that's very legitimate because it's the Patriots and they're not going to tell us. We're going to know right around noon Eastern on Sunday. Maybe Brandon LaFell winds up coming off the PUP and playing. If he's practicing Thursday and Friday, if as much as the Patriots are willing to give smoke signals, which is not much, would LaFell wind up in your ranks? And can you give us a neighborhood?
I don't want to trust a guy out of the Patriots straight out of the gate because I don't know how healthy he's going to be, even if he's healthy.
Totally get it.
That's just the Patriot way.
That's a new spin on the Patriot way. I love it.
So let's see. And I also don't like this whole picking him up off the waiver wire in week 6 because I don't like stashing somebody, though I've done that with Kristen Michael. But, you're
a woman of contradictions, Liz.
Well, I'm a woman. So I would probably put him in the, the 40-ish range, the late 30s, just outside of the top 36.
You're okay adding him at some point if he's active, but you want to see it 1 week just to make sure he's okay. That's utterly
he goes,
legit.
Like in the Leonard Hankerson, Mike Wallace sort of area for me this week.
Presumably with more upside than those players, going forward, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Let me talk about another wide receiver that I was, much asked about on Twitter. In fact, Chris Carranza said Solo on Diggs, and Nicholas Balfour said Diggs, not buying it, need to see it again. And believe me, I could go on and on and on. Stephon Diggs, the rookie sensation, Vikings wide receiver. I made the unpopular choice, clearly, if Twitter's any indication, of having Mike Wallace above Stephon Diggs, and you have him the other way around. I'll just say, I did the tape analysis on Diggs. I thought he was legit. I thought he played on both sides of the formation and really kind of put the Chiefs' corners in the torture chamber, like really, legitimately open. And so I see where folks are coming from. I'll say that my concern comes from Charles Johnson maybe coming back and not even knowing if Diggs is the receiver in 2 receiver sets, if he's out there in 2 receiver sets, which the Vikings use a lot. And so I just got gun shy, right? And you have them flipped the other way around. I'm assuming you think the upside of more of what we've seen compared to the risk of not playing is worth taking.
Well, part of this is that last week, so I do a deep sleepers column every week, and Stephon Diggs was on my preliminary list last week, and then I got cold feet because I wasn't sure that Charles Johnson, by the time this article needed to print, it was unclear as to whether he would start, and so I don't want to make the same mistake twice in a row. So just a little piece of my psychology. Also, I read something that said that Norv Turner left the door open as to whether or not Diggs had surpassed Johnson on the depth chart. And I am reminded, so you mentioned Diggs's versatility, right? Like he can play outside, he can play inside. And so I remembered a bunch of games last year, not a bunch, maybe 2, 3, where Jerry's Wright and Teddy Bridgewater had really nice rapport. And I feel like Diggs there were weeks that it was like Jerry's Wright, and there were weeks that it was Charles Johnson. And I feel like Stephon Diggs has both of those. Mm-hmm. And so why not give the guy who is able to do more and clearly clicking with his quarterback in a way that Mike Wallace does not traditionally, at least since over the past few seasons, been able to click with quarterbacks? Why not give the guy that edge? I think that this is more of a rapport issue and a just getting it issue and igniting this offense in a way that maybe Mike Wallace can't. And so because he has the momentum, I'm going to keep moving with it.
A very fair position, and like I said, one that my Twitter following seems to agree with. And Stephon Diggs was like my number 2 waiver ad of the week, so believe me, I think he should be owned. I guess I don't feel comfortable putting my week 7 results, based on the maybe of the usage, but I think I could be wrong there because I did legitimately like what I see, and I didn't think it was like, wasn't one of those cases where I watched the film and said, oh, it's just a couple of deep passes, and I don't know if that's going to recur. Like you said, pretty versatile guy. Let's wrap it up with the Charknado, maybe we'll call him. Charkandrick West. We basically ranked him the same, so that's not, we both sort of said, okay, crummy week, a lot of teams off. He's a flex if you really need one, we'd rather not use him. I have Niall Davis, basically ranked back-to-back with him, and you were much lower on Davis. Now, the workload from week 6 would say that you're right, because I think Niall Davis didn't even play 20 snaps. I think West played 46 or something. So if that workload were to continue, I have Davis too high as a maybe also potential solution. I guess, there's no right answer here, but what do you think in general about the Chiefs running back situation?
Well, I thought last week that Davis would see more goal line, and is Macklin playing? He's not.
As of right now, given what it looked like at the end of the game,
he almost died. That looked bad.
I'm gonna guess no. I didn't rank him, so.
Yeah. So I am. I don't know. You bring up many good points, Christopher Harris. I guess the answer is I ranked him so low because I don't feel like anyone should trust him. And so to put him that low, I just don't want to trust him. So maybe the game, and I feel like Kansas City's game flow is both easy to predict and then also anytime you think okay, obviously the centerpiece of this offense is missing. So this next guy who you have Andy Reid comped similarly to the guy who is now missing would see a bunch of the workload because your quarterback doesn't like to throw the ball. So this would make sense. And then they do something completely nonsensical.
Right.
So, I thought that Davis would see, because he has 20 pounds on Rick West, would see that power sort of goal line, those sort of.
Well, they didn't have those, so we don't really even know because they didn't really have those.
So do we think that they're going to see them though against Pittsburgh, who managed surprisingly to shut down all of Arizona? I mean, Chris Johnson didn't look like the Chris Johnson he had at least on tape, and I know you watch it too. From my eye, Chris Johnson looked more like the Chris Johnson who played the Bears versus the. Okay, so maybe I'm not adept enough to know whether that was Chris Johnson or that was the Steelers making something happen. But the Steelers, have been pretty good, surprising. They have exceeded expectations. Their defense has exceeded expectations. So I guess that's part of it. And I also feel like I imagine that Kansas City is going to be behind a lot. And so I just don't see a lot of opportunity for Davis.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point is I ranked him so low so people won't start him. Right? Yeah. It's kind of why I ranked Diggs lower than people wanted me to rank him, because I kind of don't think you should start him until you know how it works out. I think it's legit for you to say, Niall Davis has had some good fantasy games in the past, and he could be the touchdown maker, and maybe the offense eventually will come to life to some degree behind him. So I'm not even, I'm not saying don't own him. I'm just saying I don't want you to start him until I see it.
I think that's it. And if Macklin is indeed out of the lineup, then I just think that the Chiefs are going to be in such a hole.
Yeah.
That is he, like last week, going to have the opportunity to even
Albert Wilson is going to save them. Albert Wilson.
I own him in Dynasty.
There you go. Well,
it's a really deep league.
Yeah, it's interesting because Chris Conley was actually the starter this past week, but I would think the veteran maybe gets the nod there, but neither. all that startable. Liz, this was awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to finally get to talk to you. I think we scheduled this about a month ago.
I know. Welcome to the football season. You know what it's like. But thank you so much. I love the show. I love your Monday, Tuesday breakdowns. They're fantastic, and I appreciate being on your rankings. And we're going to definitely have to have you on the X's and Y's podcast sometime coming up.
I can't wait. All you have to do is say the word, and you know I'll be there. I hope folks got a taste of how great Liz is at her job. You can follow her on Twitter at LizLoza_FF. Again, Liz, thanks so much.
Thank you, Chris. Have a great day.
And that is our show. Hey, our merch is finally up and running correctly. You can actually go to harrisfootball.com, click on merch in the menu, and be taken to our store where you can see some stuff with our logo on it. And more importantly, 4 great designs from our listeners, which are so good. Really funny stuff. I really think you'll like them. Remember, if you've been looking for a way to give back to the show, the profits will all go to the ASPCA and the ALS Foundation. So that way we're all giving something back. Remember, Thursday night, you can ask me questions via live streaming video, which is fun. And maybe you can win some stuff, including a Skype session with me. Hey, anyway, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.
The Harris Football Podcast's opening theme is Under the Gun by Apex Manor. The end theme is Tooth and Claw by OU Villain. Subscribe to the Harris Football Podcast on iTunes and never miss an episode.